Good evening, everybody. It's amusing, is it not, to hear and see how quickly the narrative is now being changed round. They realised that the general public was just not buying this Russian blowing up their own dam nonsense whatsoever. Let's face it, when we look at it, the Ukrainians only have two narratives they can go to, and that includes the mainstream media who have been so quick and so idiotic to lay the blame at Russia's door. Let's examine the first one. it gains, there are gains for Russia in that it stops the Ukrainians from attacking. Well, that's an absolute nonsense narrative. They've had many, many goes at crossing the river, and they have all been repelled, and they've lost quite a lot of men doing that. So that's an absolute non-starter. It doesn't help Russia militarily whatsoever. It may aid the Ukrainians in that the water may be up for a while, and they will be able to try even more amphibious craft going across. The other thing that is always spouted out is Putin is evil. That makes no sense whatsoever. It's about as sensible as our British foreign minister coming out when asked deliberately if the West had any effort in blowing up this dam, actually turned around and said, and avoided the question like a politician would, and avoided telling the truth. And the most damning evidence, if you'll pardon the pun, is when he turned around and said the reason the dam is no more and is been obliterated is because Russia are in Ukraine. So he didn't actually answer the question at all, knowing full well that should it be proven that the West had anything to do with blowing this dam, this is going to come back to bite them as much as the depleted uranium shells when they got found and destroyed. The other thing you have to remember here, this is absolutely key, is that the meeting with the British Foreign Minister happened only a few hours before, and men were being evacuated before the dam actually blew up. People are now trying to spin it as an accident. It doesn't wash, I'm afraid. They were continually shelling and using HIMARS missiles on this dam. Now, it may be that the full force of the water and the weakening of the dam, but it's much more likely that it was blown up on purpose while the shelling was going on under a cover. I've spoken to people in various, shall we say, divers and members of the armed forces who tell me that this wouldn't be a difficult problem to do this whatsoever. Given today's technology and the ability of using mini subs, sounds all very James Bond, but it's very, very straightforward. As I said to someone, how likely is it that they could do this? He said, well, if they were going to do it, he said it would be the best way to do it is to lay some sort of cover. Because you're underwater, you're not really going to be too troubled by this. And he said it would be an absolute piece of cake, or as the Americans call it, a walk in the park. What you also have to remember is a couple of other things. The Washington Post actually turned around and published an article with a Ukrainian military officer that turned around and said that they were thinking about blowing the dam. And in fact, when the Russian new strategist took over, he pulled people back from that side of Kherson. They weren't forced out by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians didn't go in for 2 or 3 days and wondered what had happened. He pulled them back because of that very reason, that one, they would make it difficult to supply, and any troops left there would be cut off should they decide to blow the dam, and the Ukrainians have threatened to do this. There is also now a massive effort by, shall we say, these absolute lunatics to blame Zelensky for the Nord Stream pipeline. What you have to remember in these two instances, the Nord Stream pipeline and the dam, if they wanted to flood the river, they just had to open the sluice gates 24/7 and let the water pour out. So it made absolutely no military sense whatsoever for this dam to get blown up. The other thing that makes no sense at all is the Russians blowing up their own pipeline. And finally, people are beginning to realise this narrative is absolute nonsense. You can only fool the people for so long. If the Russians wanted to stop the supply of gas, all they had to do was turn off the tap. It's that simple, and nobody would have been any better off. It is, without question, one of the most stupidest witch hunts that I have seen in a long, long while. People were desperate to blame the Russians. And now we even have this absolute clown of a president of the Ukraine, Zelensky, asking people for loads and loads of money that he's going to spend to repair the dam. Yeah, right. And secondly, turning around and showing videos of people rescuing dogs out of rivers. It is beyond the pale. It's one of those I broke it, I can fix it scenarios. And let us not get away from what it actually was covering up. It was covering up the fact that the so-called shaping operations, well, the only thing they threw was shapes around the battlefield, and they lost loads and loads of men and loads of equipment in this counter-offensive. Now, they're not saying it's a counter-offensive, it's a shaping operation or a probe. You don't do a probe with 60 tanks and over 5,000 men. That is not a shaping operation. That is not a probe. We took more men than that to the Falklands to attack the Argentinians. We only used a fraction of them to launch a counter-offensive against them. And it has to be said that this narrative of trying to say that this is not a counter-offensive that failed miserably, and it did. There is no question whatsoever that this blowing of the dam is a deflection, the same as after Bakhmut, we suddenly had the Ukrainians' response to Bakhmut going up, where they attacked in Belgorod. You only have to look at these examples to realise, unless you are congenitally stupid, 100% died in the wool, shall we say, ethnic cleanser, or the bought and paid for mainstream media by the people that run them and own them and also get governments elected. That this narrative that they have spun about it not being a counter-offensive has failed. And it was such an abject failure. There are videos out there of the Ukrainian tanks when they've broken through the first line of defences and have realised that they are trapped and nowhere to go, running around a field in circles while the Russians take pot shots at them to the tune of the Benny Hill music. It doesn't become any more embarrassing than that. Now, there are many, many people who have different views, and what we're going to do is we're going to give them a chance on this show. So at some point in the near future, we're going to be inviting on one of the so-called pro-Ukrainian, should we say, rather more rabid type of people who try to get people's channels shut down and indeed tries to launch all sorts of campaigns and stuff against people. So we're going to invite one of them on at the same time as inviting somebody on from Russia and somebody on from Ukraine for a debate very shortly, one Sunday. And I hope you'll stay tuned for that and continue to watch this channel. This video will be put up, and while this video is playing on YouTube, I'll be available to answer any questions each night at 8 p.m. That you have. And thank you very much for listening, and have a great evening.